Our topic is the future of electricity 4.0. A warm welcome for Steve, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hear me okay? Absolute pleasure to be back with you guys. It is the third time now that I've been back and had the privilege of speaking at Sustainability Live. I missed last year. I was here 2 years ago. And I think you guys have organised the weather again for us. 2 years ago, it was the same as this beautiful walk-in. So hopefully, who cares about the tube strike today? We've managed to get here and look at this fantastic audience. So as always, I'm looking forward to meeting people, networking, having chats, discussions. And I'm going to kick off shortly by, well, talking about really where we are, the path. But I wanted to pick up first, so the videos that Glenn just played, I think all of us in the room aren't surprised by that footage anymore. It's not a shock anymore. It's a normality. We see this all the time. The thing that stood out for me was the phrase of, we must have a plan. And what I hopefully can start us all thinking about is, it's not actually that difficult to have a plan. If we break it down really to what we need to do, it's simpler than we think. So before I get into that, as we've all had a bit of disruption this morning, and because I have the luxury of being the first speaker of the day, I would like to just start with a question for everybody to make sure that you're all wide awake and you all have your thinking hats on. So my question to you, and I'm going to call it the 50% question. And 50% because everything I'm going to talk about really links into the challenge that we have to reduce our emissions by 50% by the end of this decade. So you were told no more need to shout out, no more audience participation. I would like one more on this one. So it's a very easy one to get us started. Here's your question. What do these four things have in common? Anybody got it? It's a nice, easy one to start with. Ages, brilliant. Yes, you can put the word age after all of those things to create different eras of human history. Ice Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Stone Age. But what if I was to say, maybe we've been living in one age, actually? What if I was to say that since the dawn of humanity, we've been living in an age of fire? And since harnessing the power of fire, it has fueled our evolution, undoubtedly. So you think about early humans a million years ago were using fire for security. They were using it for warmth, to protect themselves against predators, to cook food. That led to social development as people would sit around a fire while they were cooking their food, while they were staying warm. That led to increased communication, that starting of societies and communities, right through to the industrial era, where we've seen through the Bronze Ages, the Iron Ages, the smelting of metals, pottery, and then right through to fire for steam engines. So undoubtedly it came at a cost. But what you can say is that harnessing fire was probably humankind's greatest technological breakthrough. Some may say others, but this was the first, and it led to many other technological breakthroughs afterwards. But what if I was to say then harnessing it or replacing it will be our generation's defining moments? Our generation. This is our time to make the change. And we are at this inflection point now between that old world where we were living in the age of fire for all that time. We have the age of fire, which was where we witnessed volatility of energy cost and energy affordability. We witnessed high emissions and resource depletion. But by switching to the age of electric, actually we'll move away from that. We'll move to more stability. We'll move to more low emissions, low pollution, and more to resource conservation. Innovation, effectively, doesn't need to run on fire. You think about any modern innovation now. It runs on electric, and typically it runs on digital. And there'll be two key trends that I'll talk about throughout this presentation. Why is it important for us to move away from the age of fire? Well, beyond the obvious that we all know in this room, one of it is the increasing volatility of energy and the disruption that we see to energy markets. So here you see the volatility of fossil fuel, or gas specifically, across Europe over the last 3 decades. And you can see that decade upon decade, that volatility increases in terms of pricing, and as we've seen in the last few years, in terms of availability, scarcity of energy. The other obvious one is obviously the need to decarbonise for the climate crisis. So what you see there is the amount of carbon in the atmosphere over the last 200 years or so. And you see kind of huge increase starting from the late 800s to where we are today, which is, by the way, higher than it's ever been on Earth for about 2 million years. So left unabated, we know that the figures are terrible. But fortunately, we are making progress. We're looking like something around 2.5 degrees by the end of this century, based on current commitments that have been made. And that is anywhere between 2 to 5 gigatons of savings by the end of this decade. Around about 4, we think, today. What we actually need to be for the 1.5 degree pathway is 3 times that. It's 10 to 15 gigatons of savings versus today. And we can do it. We can make those extra savings. And I want to explain how we do that and where we need to put the effort. So how we produce and consume energy is the key to tackling both the energy crisis and the climate crisis. Let's spell out why that is. Simple terms, we know that the climate crisis is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, so that's things like F-gases, nitrous oxide, methane, but the vast majority of it, 3/4 of it, comes from carbon dioxide. So we know we have net zero carbon goals, and why it's important, because it's such a big piece of the puzzle. So if we need to decarbonise, where do we need to put our attention? Well, what if I said that actually 80% of those carbon emissions come directly or indirectly from the production and the consumption of energy? We need to decarbonise. Energy is the #1 thing that we need to tackle. So if we know we need to tackle energy, we need to think, well, what do we need to tackle with energy? And the two sides to the coin. So we typically think about energy supply. And not surprisingly, those emissions are coming almost entirely from fossil fuels. But what about the demand? Supply always chases demand. So as long as we have a demand for fossil fuels, we're going to burn them. And the demand is coming really from 3 sectors: industry, buildings, and transport. So we know we need to decarbonise. We know those are the areas that we need to decarbonise. Now is the perfect time, because we know what we need to do. We have the technology available to do that. And actually, we're seeing acceleration. Things that have been difficult in the last 5 years can actually be considered as catalysts for change. You think about the global pandemic. That accelerated digital by somewhere between 3 to 5 years. The way we live our lives, all of our shopping done online, delivered to home. The way we consume entertainment. We know we've carried on doing what we did during lockdown. We have lots of digital electric entertainment at home. The way we work, most of my days I sit, probably like many of you, on video calls on Teams. And it's great because, one, I don't need to travel as much as I did, which means I'm not polluting, I'm not putting as much carbon out. But also I get to spend more time with my family and my kids, which is fantastic. On the energy crisis, that's also a catalyst for change. Why do we have the energy crisis? Because we are dependent on importing fossil fuels from countries that happen to have it in the ground. If we move to more electrification and more automation for more efficient use of energy, we don't need to import that. Whether you're a homeowner putting solar panels on your roof, or a business putting in a microgrid, or you're a government putting in renewable infrastructure, we move away from that dependency, and we move away from that volatility of energy cost and availability that I showed you at the beginning. So now's the right time. The more detail in our research institute, Schneider has its own research institute. We put together a paper called Back to 2050. Very easy to find if you go on any search engine and type Back to 2050. It will give you a lot more detail about the things that I'm going to talk about today. But in short, if I was to summarize it, it talks about thinking of 2 sides of an energy coin. There is the supply side, and that's where I said everyone thinks about this. Everyone thinks about wind turbines and solar panels. How do you decarbonize energy? You make it from renewable sources. But actually, that's less than half of the solution for how we get to net zero energy by 2050. It's not just about producing or purchasing renewables. It's about what I said. It's about supply chasing demand. More than half of the solution comes from the demand side. So as long as we're heating our homes with gas boilers and we're driving petrol or diesel cars in our industries that are run by fossil fuels, we are fueling that need for fossil fuels. So we need to electrify points of consumption wherever possible. That's about 1/3 of the solution to get to net zero energy. And the last one, the shorter term one, is reducing. And this is something more critical than ever now, because who hasn't noticed an increase in energy bills? So not only by reducing can we be more efficient and we can save carbon, we can also save a lot of money in doing so as well. And it's much cheaper and easier to put measures in place, you think, to do that as well. So they're the 3 things that we need to do: replace, electrify, reduce. I want to actually say now, rather than just saying those, why it makes sense to do each of those. Why does it make sense to replace fossil fuels with renewables? Well, here you can see clearly, this is the efficiency of each of those types of fuels. So that's the primary energy that is stored in them or available into the final usable energy, the useful energy that actually gets consumed. Electricity coming from renewables is by far the most efficient form of energy. So as a result, we see great numbers like this that says over the next 10 years, this is where the extra energy is going to come from. So you can see at the bottom, there is a predicted decrease in fossil fuels and an increase in renewables, some nuclear, but the vast majority of it coming from renewables. And actually, if you look at the speed of that, particularly solar, it's like nothing we have ever witnessed in time. There you can see that in the last 10 years or so, solar has already generated as much energy as liquefied natural gas did in more than 30 years. And if you look at wind, wind has done in the last 15 years what nuclear provided over the last 50 plus years. So the rise of renewables is very clear and they're accelerating. Solar, it's anticipated, will be on the roof of 1 billion homes by 2035. And you can see that as well in the investment. So this shows the level of investment into, as an example, oil and how that's declined versus solar. So if you go back to the start of this chart, 2013, the investment in oil was 6 times that of solar. Now solar has actually overtaken the investment into renewables. So we're going in the right direction and it all makes sense to replace. But like I said, we need to electrify. Why does it make sense to electrify? So remember when I said the efficiency of the energy, the final useful energy that you can get from different energy sources. Take 2 things that we all use, our transport and our heating. So if you look at a fossil fuel vehicle, you're getting something like 25 to 30% of the actual full energy available in the raw material converted through to useful energy because of the inefficiency in the process. You compare that to what you can see on screen there for 85 to 90% for electric vehicles. And it's a similar story for heat pumps. I mean, gas boilers are actually quite efficient, but because of the nature of the way that a heat pump works, it's 4 times as efficient as a gas boiler. So transitioning to electrification of points of consumption makes absolute sense. Why wouldn't we? Well, some people might say, well, the cost is prohibitive. Not really. This is the cost of electric vehicles in different parts of the world for the point when it reaches price parity. And you can see that by next year, most parts of the world, for most sizes of vehicles, reach price parity between electric vehicles and ICE vehicles. What about the cost of electricity itself? People might say, but electricity is very expensive. The more you increase electricity in the mix, the cheaper your electricity gets. So here you can see there are no high electrification regions anywhere in the world that have high electricity prices. So if all of that makes sense, you know, the technology exists, why aren't we doing more? We are only just tapping the potential of what exists already. And of course, technology is always improving, always getting better, but less than half of the potential has been tapped into so far. We need to do much more, and that's why the forecast for electrification going forward is decade upon decade, we expect the amount of new electricity to double. It's the energy of the future. Like I said, the age of electric. So they're the 3 things we need to do: replace, electrify, and reduce. The last one, reduce. In order to do that, we need to digitize. So I talked about electric and digital is the critical piece here. You cannot measure what you cannot see. So first of all, you need connected devices. And so we can understand, how is that progressing? Well, if you look 10 years ago, we were at, 4.9 billion connected devices around the world. Over the last decade, that's tripled to about 14.5 billion. But look at the rate of acceleration. In the next 5 years alone, that's expected to more than triple again. And how do we prove this? How do we know that? Look at the rate of adoption of digital. So who can cope without internet now? We all use it daily, right? It took 7 years to get to 100 million users of the internet. How long do you think generative AI took? It took 2 months. 2 months. So the pace of digital is accelerating so fast, and our willingness to accept and adopt those technologies is increasing. And they go hand in hand. So AI enables smarter decision making. So just very quickly, it helps us optimize how we use energy. So better control, use your energy exactly where you need it. It might look at weather forecasting to say, well, it's going to be warmer tomorrow, so we can turn the heating on a bit later. It really maximizes the potential of efficiency. It helps us reduce peak consumption. So if you have solar panels, it might say, well, you have a cheap tariff at night, we're going to charge up your batteries at night, and then we're going to use solar during the day, and it will optimize the way that you use your energy to get the cheapest bills and the lowest carbon solution. And it'll also accelerate what we call time to power. So you'll read about lots of delays and challenges of getting microgrids connected to the grid and online. It's going to accelerate all of that. So overall, AI has a huge potential for good, despite what you may read about it in terms of it requires large amounts of energy. Actually, the benefits that it brings far outweigh energy that it would require. So, replace, electrify, reduce. Both of the two key things that I've mentioned through that were digital and electric. It's what we call Electricity 4.0, the fourth electrical revolution. It's our vision for how we get to the future. So I'm going to put that chart back up that showed the increase in carbon emissions or atmospheric carbon over the last few hundred years. And you can see some significant moments in time. So everyone's heard of industrial revolutions. Each time there was an industrial revolution, there was a simultaneous electrical revolution. So from the start with mechanization and steam power, Volta and Faraday were looking at how to use electricity. Then it was about scale, mass production, mass electrification. And at that point, you see this is where the curve starts to grow. This is the point of the first coal-fired power stations to fuel those industrial revolutions. Next big change was the introduction of silicon, so that enabled automation, but it also brought about early solar cells. And where we are today is about the convergence of electric and digital at scale. So electric is now, if energy has been the primary contributor to this, energy is now the primary solution for all of this. So if you switch to renewables, clean energy, and you use digitization to drive that efficiently, we believe that when you see the severity of the curve, Electricity 4.0 will deliver that 3x acceleration that we need to get to. How is it already happening around us? So what you see here is typically a model of what the electricity grid looked like for decades upon decades. We produced electricity from fossil fuels. We distributed it over large distances to points of consumption that just consumed it because it was, in the developed economies, it was relatively cheap commodity and it was widely available. The grid is very, very different today, and it's moving very, very quickly. So we have the energy transition is causing the rise of high energy markets like industry and data centers, and we're seeing decentralized generation, which is making the grid far much more complex. So here you see introduction of renewables. So the supply side is getting cleaner. That's great. We're introducing storage. We're introducing distributed energy like microgrids and like autonomous power generation. We're seeing things like EV at scale coming in to increase electrification, and data centers to power the AI that we need to help us advance. So fundamentally behind these, the DNA of our grid needs to change to be able to cope with what we need to do to get to net zero. It needs to be connected, it needs real-time load balancing, it needs to be AI-powered to drive that efficiency, and it needs a digital and software layer. So remember I said electric and digital? For me, electric and digital becomes the DNA of that new energy landscape. Digital drives efficiency and automation. Electric drives decarbonisation. It is the only vector to decarbonise our energy sources. So there's a lot of progress actually being made. We're not going fast enough, but actually let's take some of the positives. More governments are making commitments. So more than 100 countries with net zero pledges now. That covers more than 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon. And 3.3 trillion investment into clean energy this year. That's a huge increase because on the next slide you can see what that evolution looked like over the last few years. And you can see, this reflects what we're talking about, there is a declining trend in investment into fossil fuel. And because we need more energy, that additional energy is coming from the investments into clean energy sources. Now, interestingly, that bar there is up to last year's numbers, 2 trillion. So think what that curve has done this year as we move to 3.3 trillion investment. Lots of great things happening then, But what about the reality? The reality is it's not balanced. Commitments are not being made equally. There are some things being favoured over others. It's the implementation gap. So huge incentives for vehicle manufacturers and electric vehicle users, but not as much on things like heat pumps, which have a huge potential to change the way we heat our homes. If you look at that against carbon pledges, covering about 95% of what needs to be done, about 80% of that is covered by spending. The biggest challenge we've got is only 70% of it is covered by either incentives or legislation. So we have this 30% gap between policy, between pledge and between policy, the policy gap. Businesses are making more and more commitments. So if we look at science-based targets, these are the number of companies committing to science-based targets. And there's pretty much been a doubling year on year to now 8,500 more or less by the halfway point of this year. And there's a good mix. You know, it used to be predominantly large companies, mainly in Europe. There's a good split now of large and small companies and Europe and rest of world companies. So that's evolving. But the reality behind that is how much of that is actually turning into results. Last year, 10% of the Fortune 500 companies actually achieved any of their significant climate milestones. So there again, it's this pledge versus policy. It's that commitment to do things and actually getting the results from it. How do we drive the change? So we wanted to understand what actions companies are taking to see where are the gaps, what do we need to be doing differently. So we spoke to over 4,000 C-suite executives from around the world, and they were from, majority of them from companies with annual revenue over 10 billion, so who has huge influence. And the first piece of good news was really they're already planning to invest about 2% of their annual revenue on sustainability initiatives. That's about the same as a telecoms company would invest in R&D. It's a healthy amount of investment. But is it going in the right places? This is what people typically think about. If we go back to, remember I said 2 sides of the energy coin and 3 levers. We need to replace fossil fuels with clean energy, but we need to reduce our energy consumption and we need to electrify. And that's the order people think about. Clean energy means wind turbines and solar panels. Reducing is good for us because we can save some money and we can save some carbon, and electrifying tends to get thought of last. And that was very much reflected in what we saw a couple of years ago when we did the survey for the first time. We saw that about half of people were replacing energy supply, a bit less were reducing, a bit less were electrifying. When we did it last year, very different picture. So fewer commitments from people, possibly, arguably because maybe people have already got renewable purchasing in place, so that's dropped. But interestingly for me, there's a shift in mindset. It's gone from we need to be doing the right thing to I can understand the benefit of this. Particularly, you know, when I said the 2 things that have impacted, COVID and the energy crisis is forcing people to think more about energy and saving energy because of the cost of it, as well as the carbon impacts. So these are the changes that we had on the drivers, and I'm not going to dwell on all of them. Some went up, some went down, but I'm going to pick on the 4 biggest movers. The biggest mover, why do companies invest in sustainability initiatives, is because of regulation and legislation. And what did we just say before? There is a gap between pledge and policy. So we need to increase legislation because it's the number 1 driver for businesses. The number 1 driver used to be climate-related risk and moral reasons, but they've both dropped. Moral reasons is like people have moved away from we need to be seen to be doing the right thing to actually it now makes sound business sense for us to do this because we need to meet this legislation and we see a huge opportunity for savings. That's the biggest growth, big 10% shift in people saying, I see an opportunity for savings. So the reasons for actions are taking change, and people are starting to realize this concept of what I would call collateral benefits. So everyone knows what collateral damage is. What if you actually flip that and say, well, if you tackle climate crisis, this becomes a positive. What you actually get is when you tackle carbon reduction, you're actually not just benefiting the climate, but as we see more urbanization, you're improving health because you don't get pollution in cities. You're getting more resiliency. For that point I said, you're not buying fossil fuels anymore from other countries. You're making your own energy. You get productivity because you're forced to look inwardly at where are you inefficient, how can you be more efficient and more productive. And ultimately you get an ROI cost saving. In most cases, light touch stuff is 1 to 3 years, and after that you're making recurring savings. So businesses are increasingly, we're seeing, waking up to the financial benefits as well as just the legislation. And in order to achieve what they want to do, they have a simple 3-step model. So we work with about 40% of Fortune 500s now to accelerate their progress. They strategize, and that is basically, where are we today? Where do we want to be tomorrow? How are we going to get there? And who do we need on the journey with us? They then have to digitize, because like I said, you can't measure what you can't see. Electric and digital go hand in hand. That enables you to see how you're using energy, how you're generating emissions, and where you have opportunities for savings. And then you put your measures in place to actually decarbonize. Guess what? Those 3 levers on the 2 sides of the coin: replace your energy source, electrify your operations, and reduce your energy use. So, time is out. I'm going to close with a little bit just about, Schneider Electric, for those of you that don't know us, we're honored to have been recognized by Time magazine 2 years in a row as the world's most sustainable company, by Corporate Knights multiple times as the world's most sustainable company. Some of the things we do, we've helped reduce 125 million metric tons of CO2 for our customers. That's 125 million return flights from London to New York. Or it's driving a passenger car around the world 31 billion times. We've trained 1 million people in energy management so that people can learn how to be more efficient. We partner with 600,000 companies, 24 gigawatts of energy. So we advise companies on their energy purchasing to make clean choices at affordable prices. 24 gigawatts, that's about 20 million UK homes that we've advised on. And lastly, for those of you that don't know the name Schneider, because we're a business-to-business company, we're actually used by 1 in 3 electricians, and the chances are we're in your home somewhere, because we are in 1 in 5 homes around the world. So I'll wrap up there. If anyone wants to connect, carry on the conversation, please do. If any of you want to start or accelerate your sustainability journey, on the right you have the links to our sustainability advisory services. And lastly, I will point out that at 11:30, if you are able to, room 1 across there, we have future-proofing business, where we have put this into practice, and we have customers like Tottenham and Kew Gardens who are going to say what they've done and how they've made this a reality. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.